in this session, we want to look at the whole issue of school choice, but I would like to put it into the context of basic Catholic social teaching. From 1980 to 1985, I worked for the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. It was the heyday of the Reagan years, as I like to call him, Good King Ronald, and talking about tuition tax credits and vouchers was the normal conversation. To me, going around to parish communities and dioceses and trying to organize Catholic lay leaders to promote this, the most frustrating aspect of it was people saying, but Father, we made a choice to put our kid in a Catholic school. There's a free public school. We've chosen not to use it. That's our problem. And my answer would be, well, that's like a slave in 1850 saying, my grandfather was a slave, his father was a slave. That's the way it is. And so in order to move this behemoth of Catholic ennui, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that they understand that the laity, who are supposed to be the ones doing all of this work in the world, know the facts of Catholic social teaching on the issue of school choice. And so that's where I'd like to put the conversation. And then Tom has some practical experience about programs that exist, and as Anthony has already said, the upsides and the downsides of them.
Yeah, so let me just do some context setting, just so you have some stats as well. Right now, I'll preface one thing that's, whenever you talk about publicly funded school choice programs, we need to be careful not to say that it's some sort of silver bullet, right? Even if there's cities that have them, and they're well funded. I'm thinking of Milwaukee specifically. They still have a host of other issues, even though funding is no longer one of them. Quality is actually one of the biggest issues in Milwaukee. It's also important to note distinctions between programs. Every state, every program, and there's 50 of them, are different. There are promising aspects to them, and ones that I think really kind of engender peril, depending on how they're structured. Some of you I know are in choice states. You can kind of share experiences of what it's like to participate in them. Let me just give a couple background things. There's three basic forms of school choice. You have what's a voucher, or more accurately described as an opportunity scholarship. That's literally where there is money is from the state coffers are given to students that meet certain objectives that they can take to a private or Catholic school. The largest program is most expansive is in Indiana right now. You also have what's called a tax credit. That's what we have in Pennsylvania here, where businesses can give to a scholarship organization and get a tax credit, so they don't have to give that money in their federal or state taxes. In this case, it'd be state taxes that year. The newest form is called an education savings account, which is where instead of getting a full voucher where it's a whole school, you get basically a debit card, and that money parents can use for whatever educational expenses they want throughout the year. They can use it for tuition, they can use it for tutoring, they can use it for an online course, or maybe there's a language that kids want to learn that they're not able to learn. And that's how they can use that sort of a thing. A few stats. Currently, so there's 50 total school choice programs in 25 states plus DC. That includes voucher, tax credit funded scholarships, ESAs, tax credits, 23 voucher programs in 13 states, 5 ESA programs, education savings accounts, and 20 tax credit funded scholarship programs in 17 states. 16 of the programs are specifically meant for students with special needs of some sort. Oftentimes, that's also a strategy for getting programs to expand. You start with something. It's actually it's much easier to pass something for special needs students than it is for a general population. So oftentimes the thought is we'll start with special needs kids, get the program going, and then expand it. Sometimes that's the approach. Average funding amounts for the program. This is actually important to know, because sometimes there can be, depending on the cost amount, it can be more costly to participate in a program than it is to benefit from it. So just under $5,000 average scholarship amount. It's about $6,300 in voucher programs, $2,500 in tax credit programs. I think that's closer to what it is in Pennsylvania. Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Actually, ESA programs are over $10,000, and the special needs programs are around $7,200 per student. By the way, all this data is available at the American Federation for Children. They're the leading entity that's advancing and passing new laws. In total number of students, we're looking at just shy of 400,000 students nationwide. That's not, it's a little more than just, Catholic schools are the majority of those, but there are other private schools involved as well. The vast majority of that, nearly 400,000, is tax credits. So tax credit scholarship kids are the most common. There's only about 6,000 kids on ESAs right now. The state with the most choice students is Florida with just over 110,000. The second most is Arizona with about 66,000. So those are just a few stats. A couple of other issues that frequently come up that are worth noting. And it's kind of cautions of the programs, right? So transparency and information sharing. It's good to ask what sort of information you're being asked to share. Different states have different levels of accountability. The basic notion is that a state wants, if they're going to give you money for it, they want to know whether it's working. I think any funder of anything would want to know that. But to the extent that you have to participate in a given, take which tests provide which information. Sometimes there can be a sliding scale on those, but that's something to keep in mind. Oftentimes, one unintended consequences of participating. This is, I know schools in New Orleans have had to deal with this. As oftentimes they have to hire additional staff to help facilitate the program. There's more, obviously reporting requirements. There's a lot of information sharing, a lot of just administration of the program. So sometimes additional staffing is required. The laws change depending on whether it's a full or partial tuition. So for instance, if the tax credit is only for $2,500, is it part of the law that has to be accepted by the school as full tuition, or can it be applied as partial tuition? Different states have different laws. That's why some states are seen as kind of better school choice locations for schools to go and grow. There is at least a fear of a slippery slope when it comes to things like, do Catholic schools have to adhere to everything that the Department of Education says on any issue, controversial or otherwise? Or are there content requirements? All of a sudden, now that you're taking federal government money, do you have to adhere to various content requirements? So those are just some of the concerns. I think some of them can be overinflated. Sometimes they're kind of sleeping giants, and they should be taken more seriously. Let me stop there. Those are just some big picture bullets to hit. And I know you'll get into the program here in Pennsylvania as well. So it's obviously, from our perspective, school choice can be really transformational. The public should care about getting more kids into excellent schools, and this is one way to do it. But obviously, there's challenges inherent. So I think you guys especially need to know what your states. If your state does have a law, you need to read it. You need to know what it is and how to participate. If there's faulty aspects to it, you have to get involved with changing those. School choice laws and how they're adopted are changed and modified every single year. So I know, Tom, you know how that happens in Pennsylvania. So just my kind of big picture look at it, but I would say definitely take it very seriously. And I'm going to call an Uber, but I'll listen for a few more minutes.
Okay, so the theological framework for this. The Rights of Man in Natural Law by Jacques Maritain makes the point: man is constituted a part of family society before being constituted a part of political society. So that's the fundamental unit of society, is the family. We fast forward from Maritain to the Second Vatican Council, which in Lumen Gentium we hear about the family being what? The domestic church. And then in Apostolicam Actuositatem of the Council, the mission of being the primary vital cell of society has been given to the family by God himself, which is to present itself as the sanctuary of the church. And in the education document of Vatican II, Gravissima Indicationis, we read, parents have a primary and inalienable duty and right in regard to the education of their children. And then the document goes on to say, nevertheless, the family, quote, requires the help of society as a whole. So you have the family as the primary unit of society. The family, parents, have the right to direct the education of their children, but the parents also require, of necessity, the help of society as a whole. Then the Code of Canon Law, 226, says Because parents have given life to their children, they have a most serious obligation and enjoy the right to educate them. And then, again, back to Vatican II, but this time Dignitatis Humanae, the decree on religious liberty, parents have the right to decide in accord with their own religious beliefs the form of religious upbringing which is to be given to their children. And it goes on, the civil society must therefore recognize the right of parents to choose with genuine freedom schools or other means of education. Parents should not be subjected directly or indirectly to unjust burdens because of this freedom of choice. And then again, go to Canon number 797. It's necessary that parents enjoy true freedom in selecting schools. The Christian faithful must therefore be concerned that civil society acknowledge this freedom for parents and also safeguard it with its resources in accord with distributive justice. And there is the linchpin of Catholic social teaching on the issue. It's the issue of distributive justice. Now, interestingly, we find all of this enshrined in a Supreme Court decision from 1925, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. And that took, the origin of the case came from the state of Oregon, where the nativist anti-Catholic movement was trying to close down the Catholic schools and made it a requirement that everyone had to go to the state schools. The nuns used a very clever angle that they were being put out of business by the state, and the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, quote, the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public school teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional duties. That's the Supreme Court in 1925. Interestingly, that section of the court decision ends up being the only Supreme Court decision in history ever quoted in a papal encyclical. Pius XI quotes that in Divini Elius Magistri as an example of proper juridic analysis. And then Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN holds that education is a basic right of every person, number one, that it should be free and compulsory, at least at the elementary level, and, quote, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So children have a natural right to education. Number two, it ought to be free and compulsory, at least at the elementary level. And three, parents ought to be free to determine what kind of education that is. Now, we have to note with regret that often these very lofty principles are given more lip service than anything else. And as a result, the freedom to choose schools in keeping with parental values is limited de facto to those who have the ability to pay for the right. But as has been observed, a civil right penalized is a civil right suppressed. The best example of that is the former poll tax in the southern states, whereby if you wanted to vote, you were free to vote after the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody was free to vote. But if you're going to vote, it was going to cost you $25. Well, if you didn't have the $25, you were no longer free to vote. And the Supreme Court eventually had to come to the understanding and the realization that that's a civil right penalized. Now, the church's involvement with this is twofold. First of all, yes, there is an internal dimension to this, but at the same time, there is an issue of justice that we ought to be representing in the civil forum. And sometimes, particularly in the 60s and 70s, we heard people say, oh, we ought not to be concerned about our rights. We ought to be concerned about the rights of the poor and the marginalized and so forth. And no greater advocate of the rights of the poor and the marginalized than John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris says, we cannot claim to represent the rights of others if we have not, first of all, claimed our own rights. And so the violation of our rights as Catholics, but first of all, as human beings and American citizens, is consistently violated by the current unjust system. And secondly, we need to put this in a bigger context than the Catholic. That Catholic schools, as we've made this point repeatedly in the past 2 days already, is Catholic education benefits the whole of society. If we're producing someone who is literate, we're producing someone who is honest, we're producing someone with a work whole of society. Catholic education, therefore, doesn't simply benefit Catholics. I think that was one of the concerns, for example, here in Philadelphia, when the theory was that the Catholic schools in the inner city are going to close, and people went into panic mode and said, then what's going to happen? Well, exactly what's going to happen, because a very, very serious part of civil society is no longer going to be there. Another point to be made is that Catholic schools are places of social, racial, and civic harmony, right? You don't find race riots in Catholic schools. My first day last year doing a student-teacher evaluation in a suburban public school in New Jersey, I walked onto the campus and was on lockdown because there was a race riot in a suburban public school. We don't have that because we're able to deal with those issues in a gospel context. Pius XI, in that same encyclical, said, indeed, a good Catholic, precisely because of his Catholic principles, makes the better citizen, attached to his country and loyally submissive to constituted civil authority in every legitimate form of government. So Catholic schools then fulfill a dual purpose, educating students for citizenship in the present world, as well as for the world to come. A second point that needs to be made is that pluralistic societies require a plurality of educational forms. In the past 30 years, we have seen all kinds of provisions being made in the educational setting for children with various special needs. The one area that's never been taken account of seriously by the government is children for whom religion is an important need. Their parents don't want for them a truncated educational experience. Those spiritual needs need to be attended to. If all schools perform a public purpose, and we hope that they do, then justice indicates that all schools merit public support. In times of economic hardship, it would be worth noting that government policies which favor the continued existence of alternative forms of education could turn out to be much more cost-effective than the need to absorb the populations of non-governmental schools. When Bishop Bevilacqua was the auxiliary in Brooklyn, he required every Catholic school in the diocese to have a sign out front that says, this school saves you, the taxpayer, X million dollars a year. Now, some people thought that was crude and in your face, but he was from Brooklyn. But it was a very salutary warning, a gentle but firm warning. Better to give us something than we close up shop and you have to pay the entire bill. And he just had it costed out. In the city of New York, it's $17,000 per child. We have 200 children in this school. Here's what it saves you, the taxpayer. And people have to be made aware of that issue. And then the third point, the recognition of the government's role in fostering educational pluralism. Jamal, in writing to the signatories of the Helsinki Accord, said, quote, freedom for families to choose the schools or other means which provides this sort of education, religious education for their children, without having to sustain directly or indirectly extra charges, which would in fact deny them this freedom. And you see this consistency of papal teaching on this issue. Indirect or direct. So there's one, the direct, Oregon tried that, closed down the Catholic schools. The indirect is make people pay to exercise their right to use those schools. And then in Familiaris Consortio, he wrote, the right of parents to choose an education in conformity with their religious faith must be absolutely guaranteed. And then I would recommend very, very highly the section in the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's 3 or 4 pages dealing with this issue of parents' rights in education, and specifically the funding issue. But the short of it is this. The compendium says public authorities must see to it that public subsidies are so allocated that parents are truly free to exercise this right without incurring unjust burdens. Parents should not have to sustain, directly or indirectly, extra charges which would deny or unjustly limit the exercise of this freedom. The refusal to provide public economic support to non-public schools that need assistance and that render a service to civil society is to be considered an injustice. Whenever the state lays claim to an educational monopoly, let's come back to that point, it oversteps its rights and offends justice. The state cannot, without injustice, merely tolerate so-called private schools. Such schools render a public service and therefore have a right to financial assistance. And then John Stuart Mill, not exactly a friend of religion in general or the Catholic Church in particular, nonetheless says, first of all, that government ought never to be involved in education, right? But if it is, he says, it might leave to parents to obtain the education where and how they please and content themselves with helping to pay the school fees for the poorer classes of children. So what's the job of the government in education? It's to pay for it, not to be involved in it. I'm going to share with you a book tomorrow called Is Public Education Really Necessary? And then finally, the responsibility of Catholics to secure parental freedom. And the church sees it as her responsibility in a twofold way. First, to advance the cause of parental freedom of choice in education is as a global issue. And secondly, to inspire Catholics to work for the establishment of programs which allow that principle to function. And in Pope Benedict's address, which I cited yesterday at Catholic U in 2008, the Pope said, no child should be denied his or her right to an education in faith, which in turn nurtures the soul of a nation. Notice how the Pope links up the right to a Catholic education for us as we're considering it, but that education, again, redounds to the benefit of civil society. And here again, this is a unique responsibility of the laity. We don't need one more person in the sanctuary. We do need thousands more in the world doing what Vatican II said the laity ought to be doing. It ought not to be our responsibility as priests to go out and do this footwork. We should have formed the people properly in our schools and from the pulpit that they know what their responsibility is. And so there, again, we come back to Vatican II and the decree on the laity. Laymen ought to take on themselves as their distinctive task the renewal of the temporal order. Among the tasks of this apostolate, Christian social action is preeminent. And then in John Paul's landmark document on the laity, Christi Fidelis Laici, he says, the lay faithful are never to relinquish their participation in public life. That is, in the many different economic, social, legislative, administrative, and cultural areas which are intended to promote organically and institutionally the common good. This is not the mixing of church and state. This is simply talking about laity as citizens representing, first of all, a general moral principle, and then secondly, representing their own rights. It would be as incongruous as to say that in 1960, if a black started to talk about civil rights, that was a self-serving concern. Well, of course it was self-serving, but it was also a right that needed to be represented, and he was no more wrong for doing it simply because he had a black face rather than someone who had a white face. So we ought not to be turned off by the accusation that in some way this is something that we're doing just for ourselves. And then finally, John Paul, in speaking to UNESCO officials, said, "Allow me to claim in this place for Catholic families the right, which belongs to all families, to educate their children in schools which correspond to their view of the world." And very simply, we go back to the point that if there is a right, and that right is acknowledged in natural law, it's enshrined in the UN Charter of Human Rights, and it's the consistent social teaching of the Church, that right cannot be penalized. And that's the point that we have to drive home to our people and give them the tools, the intellectual, philosophical basis that they can go out and do the appropriate lobbying work for us.
That's great. Can I get a copy of that? You get a lot of.
It'll cost you.
Well, sorry.
Actually, that was published in First Things.
Oh, really?
By me, but.
That's cool. I'm sorry, on a late afternoon, I'm reminded of, you have to listen to me again, 2 in a row, I'm reminded of like W.C. Fields, a famous Philadelphian, who said, first prize, or paraphrase him, first prize is you have to listen to me for 1 lecture, second prize is you have to listen to me for 2. I would have challenged Anthony a little bit, because he was pouring a little bit of, he's very knowledgeable, and he spent a lot of time on this. He's worked in all the states he's mentioned. He knows all those people. So he had all these appropriate cautions about school choice. He said, it's not a silver bullet. Well, if I could use a different cliche, it is a game changer, and it's happening right now in all these different states. And I don't know where everybody's from. I know here in Philadelphia, we have a very strong sense of things are the way they are, and they've always been that way, and they always have to be that way. And we've been sort of cowed into this. People are doing radical things on school choice in a lot of different places. It can be done. In Indianapolis, which he mentioned, in Indianapolis right now, the criteria for getting a voucher, and I'm agnostic as to the former school choice, you talk about the different ones, savings accounts and tax credits, and I'd be happy to talk about any of that with anybody following up.
And I'd be willing to talk about the caveats that have to be brought into the
and
picture.
They are.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
let's not get seaweeded down with the caveats when we look at what the main chance here is. In Indianapolis right now, the law is, and the law was put in place by really smart, strategic donor, actually, a very smart guy, took a 7 or 8 year approach, made all these relationships with the guy who then became the governor, had this all wired through the state. It wound up happening. The way it works now simplistically is, if you're in a failing school district, a kid in a failing school district, they find the amount of money that the state spends on that child's education, and then that essentially a check for that amount goes with that child to whatever school they want.
The dollar follows the scholar.
In Philadelphia, that would be $16,000 a year per student that they're spending on these kids in horrible schools. What if you went to, I've said this a number of times to different principals and presidents of different parochial schools and Catholic schools. I said, what if every kid who showed up at your door had a check for $16,000 every year attached to them? What would you do? It would change everything. And again, this isn't science fiction, because it's happening 2 states away. Now, I'm not saying that would be easy to do. I'm saying it is possible to do it. That would change all of our discussions about all these things. It wouldn't be a question of managing enrollment decline and how are we going to get through to next year. It would be, how do we possibly accommodate all the kids that we're going to have here? We can do teacher salaries, we can do new gym, we can do, all of this would change, and it's not science fiction.
And Indianapolis, I think the Catholic school enrollment is up 35%.
How would it not be?
Sure.
Now, the problem, Nevada just passed one of these last year, and their problem is they don't have Catholic schools. And so they have the potential for people doing this, but they don't have an infrastructure of schools because they just didn't build very many. So now people are thinking, how do I do the economics? Can I build a $2 million building based on this thing that may or may not be? But in the places that already have an infrastructure, we're the ones who should be the people who are the most active and creative about going ahead and doing this. Right here in Pennsylvania, we have, as people know, this EITC and OSTC, these tax credits. They're good. They're sort of half a loaf. They're a lot better than nothing. A lot better. But our minimum should be to preserve those. But if we think about expanding them, we could start getting into other things. Let's just take the logic of the current OSTC system now. And I know that people from independent mission schools were here earlier. It's a lifeline for them. I mean, it's not sufficient, to keep those inner city schools open. But without it, they'd all be gone. And again, in the Wild West world of having a big expanded one, all their lives would be different, all their conversations would be different. But let's just play out our current situation to its logical where it's headed. Actually, if I could back up just a step, we had a strategic planning exercise not too long ago where we kind of went through, over the last 25 years in Philadelphia, we've been spending money on teacher enrichment and some capital things and scholarships, and it's great. Everybody's happy with all of those things. And with even pretty rigorous evaluation, we're really happy with each one of those investments. If you took the last 25 years and you projected that over the next 25 years, and we did the exact same thing and spent the exact same amount of money, there'd be no Catholic schools left here. I mean, the number of schools has shrunk in half. So whatever it is that we're doing on the illusory side is not enough to change the overall landscape. Let's imagine a place like this or some other city where you do have, it's not no choice, you have pretty good choice, you know, but it's helping poor kids, especially kids in failing schools in needy areas. What are you going to wind up with 25 years from now? You're going to wind up with a bifurcated Catholic school system of tax credit or otherwise supported inner city schools that are wonderful and they're helping children in need, and it's great. And you're going to wind up with wealthy and expensive private Catholic schools that are serving the elite, and nobody in the middle class going to Catholic school. Is that the vision of the Catholic Church that any of us would be other than repulsed by? And that's kind of the direction that things are going, but for policy changes that are going to provide, they're going to be based on public financing. I loved what you were talking about it's not a question of mobilizing priests who are already overtaxed and have so many other things to say. Hey, you have to go to the state capitol and come up with these policy changes. But it is a question of getting the people in our parishes to know that it is their responsibility, giving them not just permission, but encouragement to say, this is a huge existential thing. It's happening in other places. It could happen here. You have the responsibility to go get these things done. And there's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of, as you said, caveats and other things that got to be right. But if we want to have vibrant Catholic schools, this is the way to do it, and it's not impossible.
When I was in about first or second grade, I remember my mother approaching the pastor. As I mentioned to you gentlemen yesterday, she was quite a feisty character. And she said to the pastor, Monsignor, I'm tired of paying twice for education. I pay for a school system that I never intend to use, and then I pay for the school that my son goes to. Okay. He said, yes, 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 yes. And she said, I think what we ought to do is close down every Catholic school in the state of New Jersey for 1 week. Parenthesis, at the time, 1 out of every 2 children in the state of New Jersey was in a Catholic school, right? And say to the governor, they're all yours. And the pastor said to her, oh, Mrs. Stravinskas, we wouldn't want people to think that we're bad citizens. And you can see that was the mentality of the 50s. Huh? We were more concerned about looking good. And now, of course, it's not 1 out of 2, it's not even 1 out of 10 kids in the state of New Jersey that's in a Catholic school. And in some instances, if we threatened to close, the public schools would be happy because they don't have kids either. So,
well, just even using your example, and I was being, speculating about if every kid in Philadelphia had the $15,000 or $16,000 spent on them attached to them, the first rejoinder after the church and state one, which is easily addressed, is, well, where would all that money come from? The answer, and it's staggering. It's already being spent on them. It's not like the state has some magic capacity to create money for education that it spends. These are all tax dollars that people pay for education. I think we have a very relatively easy case to make to say, wouldn't you rather, you're already spending $16,000 on this kid's education, would you rather have them go to this terrific parochial school where they're going to get a great education in a safe environment, or go to this nightmare school a block away? I think most people who are writing those property taxes, regardless of their faith, would say, that's an easy one.
well, again, last night we saw the video of Waiting for Superman.
Yeah.
And what was the the prime obstacle to the development of anything educationally is the teachers' unions.
I was going to mention that. That's such a high hurdle.
Well, and you see, in New Jersey, the very first month that Chris Christie began as governor, he tackled the teachers' unions. And he's been hounded by them ever since. They despise him. Forget about Bridgegate. They hated him long before Bridgegate, all right? Because he pulled back on their pensions. I mean, he just went with a meat cleaver to the entire thing. And he could be giving a talk on shore preservation, and they've got a shill in the audience from the teachers union saying, "Why do you hate our children?" All right? And notice it's always in the context of destroying our children, not our sinecure that we have here. Okay.
In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the single largest political spender is not any corporation, it's not any rich individual, it's not any other, it's the teachers' unions. They spend $18 million in the last election cycle just on this state. They have full-time, many full-time people devoted full-time to fighting all these things. School choice is what they see as their enemy because it would introduce competition to the system and it would allow some people to leave the reservation and no one should be allowed to leave.
Well, there was an instance in the town where I went to high school, Toms River, New Jersey, which has 2 parish schools, a grammar school and a high school, roughly 1,000 in each place. And it was discovered serendipitously that the administrators of every public school in the district, whether or not Catholic, had their children in St. Joe's Elementary or Secondary School. All hell broke loose about this. So much so that the Toms River School District initiated a policy that if you work for the Toms River School District, you must have your children enrolled in the Toms River school system. And we went public with this and said, not only do the teachers' unions want to keep poor people hostage in the inner city, now even if you have the money to spend, they don't want you to spend it, right? Now it blew up in their faces terribly. Of course, it was unconstitutional and all the rest of it. But that's the lengths to which they will go in order to inhibit the development of an alternative school system.
One of the ways that we can work against that problem is that so often school choice is framed as there's Catholic schools and public schools. It's really, when John Newman came here to Philadelphia, there was 1 Catholic school. There was 1 parochial school in the entire diocese. By the time he died, there were close to 100. One of the reasons that it wasn't that people before thought Catholic school, we don't need them. There wasn't a strong need because the public schools before that weren't, during the time when he was here, it was time of, that's when the nativism was rising, immigration was coming in, and the public schools deliberately started teaching Protestantism to civilize these, uncouth Catholics coming in from somewhere else. So the kids were deliberately being taught anti-Catholic ideology at the
I dealt with that this morning in the New York context.
Oh, sorry.
Archbishop Hughes.
But
Same thing, yeah.
But the model, this was 160 years ago, 170 years ago. That's what we're fighting now, which is the same thing, which is if nobody's allowed to go to anything other than these public schools where, again, this isn't the time or place for it, but a lot of the things that they're being indoctrinated and taught there are deliberately anti-Catholic and deliberately desire a very competing ideology to one that we all share. There has to be some kind of alternative. And I'm posing that it doesn't have to be Catholic schools and public schools. 2 miles that way, let's say that you lived here in this spot. Some of you probably do. But let's say you were a taxpayer right here in this spot. 2 miles up this road is a public elementary school called, what is it called? I actually wrote it down. Edward Heston Elementary School. It's not particularly notorious, but on the school rating systems that they have here in Philadelphia, on a score of 1 to 10, their safety score is a 5. 5's pretty bad, and that means there's violent crime there. Their math achievement score is a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, and their reading score is 2. And again, taxpayers here are paying $16,000 a year per pupil to send them to this dangerous school where they are objectively not learning. If you go 2 miles this way, exactly 2 miles, I Google mapped it on the way over, there's a school called Torah Hebrew Academy. I've been in there. It's great. I mean, other than the yarmulkes, you would think that you were at a Catholic school in the 1950s. There is so much life. The faith is woven into all the different things. The kids there score fantastically on exams. Parents are involved. There's such a sense of life and community there. In a school, a more robust school choice environment, how many people wouldn't rather have their tax dollars going to pay for any kid from this area, whatever faith there? I'll tell you what, I would send my kid there in a heartbeat before I would send them to that other school. And I think that most parents would too. Why not give the parents that kind of choice rather than say, now again, that goes to a little bit to, we need to make this not just about Catholic schools. It needs to be ecumenical.
This was my point. In the 1950s, when we talked about, they even had the nasty name for it, parochiaid.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to get the idea across. This is like Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
This is, public money going into someone's private coffers and all the rest of it. And it's interesting. The two prime objectors to any kind of government assistance to non-public school parents, and let's emphasize that, it's parents. We don't want a penny of the government money into our schools, right? Parents are the ones who get the money. We'll come back to that point in a moment. But in the 1950s, the two principal objectors to any kind of parochiaid were the Southern Baptist Convention and the Jewish lobby.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that the Southern Baptists, since they have gotten into the school business, have a new reading of the Constitution, which no longer suggests that it's a violation of the First Amendment, okay? And many, many Jewish organizations, Hagudath Israel and so forth now, are actually very staunch supporters of various forms of government aid. And it's exactly the point that Tom is making. We should make sure that we form intelligent, ecumenical, and interfaith alliances with those people so that the anti-Catholic specter can't be raised as the first line of defense against it. Father Ian.
The one thing that does make me a little nervous, and if people have said this to me and I don't have a reply, is if everything like that were to happen, what about Islamic schools, Wahhabism, schools that teach Sharia law that, like I would see, is like maybe really being threatening to our society? How would we distinguish ourselves from that and what we're asking for in that instance?
In general, that's a very specific and a really good question. The general response, that's a subset of the question of how do you ensure quality? And the ensured quality question is a real one. I would suggest that we would do that in general, ensuring quality the same way we do everything else in our society, is let the market work it out. People don't say, my kids are going to a terrible school and I'm thrilled about that. They, over time, will pick better schools. Now, the particular example of the kind of Wahhabism or other things, a lot of that could be addressed through accreditation and standards. Not saying you're not allowed to teach this, but saying you need to have a certain academic level in order to qualify for these scholarship funds, which almost all Catholic schools do as it is right now. I guess I could imagine a situation where they had extremely high quality academics and that, but that doesn't feel like that's where we are now. I would err on the side of allowing parents to make that choice.
Yeah. A pluralistic society has to allow for that kind of a problem to emerge. But I would say this, and this is piggybacking on Tom's point. I've traveled extensively in the Middle East and North Africa, and the Islamic schools are abysmal.
Yeah.
So much so that some of the staunchest Muslims make sure that they send their kids to Catholic schools.
Yeah.
Because they learn absolutely nothing. I mean, it's really, really pitiful. And in my travels in the Middle East, I found that if I encountered a Muslim whom I had for drivers and guides and God knows what else, if the person were intelligent, open-minded, and civil, I could automatically guess the person had gone to Catholic school. And a number of years ago, Cardinal Groholewski, the former prefect of Catholic education, said the most important thing the church can do for peace in the Middle East is to continue to operate Catholic schools. And so, yeah, and interesting, he had come back from a trip from Pakistan, where the opening chapter of the book from the Ministry of Education is the first chapter is on Catholic schools in Pakistan. So, and that's another myth that we have to dispel, that our schools are these cells of intolerance, that, you know, if you have all these little Catholic kids, you know, hibernating together, they're going to turn out to be terrible bigots. Well, again, all the surveys show precisely the opposite, that actually because our kids are secure in their Catholic faith, they can go into society and be very, very open in dealing with other people. And so the other issue, when I mentioned about the whole question of, you know, one of the objections is government control, you know, with the money. Number one, we already have a good deal of government control in 1,000 different ways, all right? But the other issue is to present it in the context of, let's say, the issue of food stamps. That's why I said the money goes to the individual, who then makes the choice about where to spend it. When the government gives a poor person $50 of food stamps, that person decides, I'm going to A&P or ShopRite or whatever else, and the government can't tell ShopRite how to run their store, right? The person who has the benefit is the one that uses it. And the benefit of the voucher program is it emphasizes, first of all, the Catholic social principle, parents are the primary educators of their children. And then secondly, it gives them the opportunity to demonopolize the whole situation by their own free choice.
This is also one of those ones, I know I can tell some people have engaged with this, some people just read about it. This is one of those ones where, one of those policy areas where we've all heard we've been flooded with the arguments against it, but I assure you that it's one of those things that the more you look into it, the more you realize that most of the objections have been adequately met. We have tons of data. Anthony mentioned American Federation for Children, which is a great organization doing it. I would also draw people's attention to the Friedman Foundation, named after Milton Friedman. They're dedicated to just this issue. And their website is full of answers to all the questions. Here's what this state is doing. Here's how they're doing it. Here's how you respond.